Hey guys, this is Oakley, and I'm here with two guests. We're going to be doing the geopolitics of the old world. So I'm here with Arch Warhammer and Grey Hunter. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Arch, you can go first.
Hello, I am Arch. I run a little bit of a lore channel over at Arch Warhammer.
And I'm Grey Hunter. I run a kind of little bit of everything channel over at Gaming Shenanigans.
You guys both have covered this stuff much more in depth, so we're here all together to try and look at this sort of broadly. And this is mostly geared towards people who are new to Warhammer, and so we're going to be going over the major and minor factions, just trying to dive into, okay, here's where they are on the map, so you can see that in front of you. We've outlined the different factions, and also keep in mind as we go through this that these faction borders are not entirely canon. A lot of the times you'll find that this changes over the course of Warhammer history, and also it's kind of hard to define how CA is going to pick and choose the borders as well. But anyways, let's go ahead and dive into this. So we're going to start with sort of the border relations and all that with the Greenskins, one of the major announced factions. So I'll pass this on to Lucas, and we'll be looking at the Greenskins. So basically looking at their internal politics and how they deal with their neighbors.
Alrighty, so Greenskins, borders. Ha 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 ha. But in essence, the Greenskins don't really have that much in the way of politics. Like, their main thing is to fight among themselves, to see who is the biggest and the strongest. So, when it comes to politics for the Greenskins, it's more a case of who's got the biggest army, who's the meanest son of a bitch in camp, and has he got the drive and guts to go and attack something outside of wherever he happens to be? When they eventually do raise an army, they go off on this thing that I could. Arch, can you do a warg properly? Can you actually say warg? Because I
I
can't for the life of
could,
me.
but it requires me to make a very, very loud and somewhat obnoxious
That's
noise,
true.
so
Maybe
I'll
maybe
refrain.
Oakley can find a clip that actually has an orc going warg because I can't do it justice. But eventually, when they raise an army, they go off on this thing called a warg, which is basically kind of like a crusade. They pick a spot in the civilized world and go, right, we'll be having that, thanks. It's very loud, very noisy. They kill everything in their paths. These
And their
guys are
goals
brutal. They're
can,
like Mongols. They're what, sorry?
their goals often have no real existence in reality. Like there was a goblin
Pretty
war boss that
much.
declared a wog on Ulthuan without any plans as to how they were going to get across, the ocean, etc.
Yes, Ulthuan, for the uninitiated, is a island in the middle of what is basically the Atlantic Ocean. Orcs don't really have boats. You can see the slight problem there.
Yeah, so the reason we started off with these guys is because their politics and geopolitics relations to their neighbors is easy. They they fight amongst
They hate
themselves,
everyone.
yeah, and they hate everyone. So don't expect them to have too much of an alliance with anyone. Sometimes games in the past have kind of roped them in with chaos, and they've tried to have some. You guys were saying before, try to have some justification for that. But if you want to stick to the lore, these guys basically just do their thing, and once there's a powerful enough leader, they'll lash out at kind of the nearest target to them. So the politics for them is pretty easy. We can see them here kind of bordering mostly the dwarves, so expect to see a good amount of friction between those two, and that's, I guess, a good segue, talking to the dwarves. So from what I understand, the dwarves have been in the old world for a long time. They had a vast, sprawling network of just territories, and then in the War of the Beard, I believe it was, right, guys, against the elves, they lost a lot of that. So now they're clinging on to their territories, and I'll let Arch kind of take over from here.
Yes, the War of the Beards, as it was called by the High Elves, and the War of Vengeance, as called by the Dwarves, because they figured they had a little bit more of a valid cause belie. That took out vast amounts of the Dwarves' Empire's strength, and then came Nagash's attempt at, well, turning the entire world into a bunch of undead, Nagash being the biggest, baddest necromancer to have ever lived at this point, or, well,
And my boy.
unlived. Indeed. So he tried to wipe out the world, essentially, but his spell didn't go quite as planned and caused catastrophic volcanic eruptions all along the World Edge Mountains in which the dwarves lived. And, well, volcanoes are bad like that. They're not really something you can just gate out. So, of course, escape and save the world, but slight divergence. Anyways, today the Dwarf Empire is a shadow of its former self, and it is divided between several kings. Each king has his own little halls. You could technically have a king ruling over 20 drunken dwarves in a tavern somewhere, although usually unlikely, as each king has, at the very least, some form of holding under his command, even if it's just a fortified tavern, some kind of karak, as the dwarves call it. All of these kings also have allegiance to the dwarven high king, although allegiance, yes, but necessarily agree and obey him, that's a little bit more wonky. So you could definitely make an argument for controlling a single Karak and then having to deal with all the other dwarf kings through diplomacy and the occasional use of blunt objects. But they're usually friendly towards each other at the very least.
Hmm. And then,
Something to point out
yeah.
when it comes to dwarven politics as well is that if you ever give them a slight, they will remember it because every hold has this little book. They've got a little book. They've got a little list. Of course they do, and their list is every single grudge that's ever been done against them. And the Dwarf High King has a really really big version of this book called the Great Book of Grudges. If they're ever called upon to help somebody out, they consult this thing. And if you've given them a slight, no, we're not helping you. They're very serious about holding grudges.
So we can
And the grudge does not necessarily need to be anything large. Like that's also kind of important. Like we're not talking
Yes,
like, oh,
that's
you
true.
killed my grandfather or something along those. Like, no, 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 no. You insulted my grandmother's choice of clothing 693 years ago. I'm a shit on
Oh,
you now.
there was a beautiful one. There was a beautiful one. I think it was in the dwarf law book where somebody paid them 2 coins less than the agreed amount for construction work they did. That went down in the Book of Grudges. It was a mistake. But they didn't even say, hey, by the way, this is 2 coins short. They just put it down in the Book of Grudges.
Sounds about right.
So if we'll contrast that to the Greenskins fight amongst themselves, and then they're overall pretty aggressive, whereas the dwarves relatively peaceful with each other. They're not too aggressive. They just want to hold on to their provinces and their karaks. And in terms of border relations, it can go sour pretty quickly, but not sour to the point where they'll fight against you and invade you. They just won't help you. Is that
Yeah,
correct? Yeah.
they're kind of
More
neutral in that
isolationist.
sense. Yeah, they're like
They have very little interest in actually invading anybody because they don't give a shit about flat land. Like
pretty much,
they like their mountain holds. There is a
and everything is
dwarven
inferior
indeed. Everything
according
is
to them.
inferior. Everything that is not dwarven. And they have this ancient, well, myth, I could say, a common superstition that if you live under the open sky for too long, you go just slightly crazy. So
Hmm.
they'd rather
Yeah.
stay where they are.
Okay, well that I think fleshes it out. So the dwarves then are kind of located here in the mountains. They stick mostly to themselves. If anyone tries to move in on them, they'll kind of fend them off. So the greenskins to the south and east, they'll have friction. Wood elves over to the west, we'll discuss that later. There's generally some friction there, but you won't be seeing elves going to the mountains or dwarves going to the forest. There's kind of a demarcated zone there that follows the terrain anyways.
Pretty
Um,
much.
so I guess we'll move on to the last two factions, and those kind of are both coupled, and that's namely going to be the Empire and the Vampire Counts. So I guess we'll pass this on to you guys, but the Vampire Counts were formerly a part of the Empire who have sort of technically broken off. It's sort of one of the municipalities of the small states, I guess you could say, that broke off. If you guys could touch on maybe a little bit of how that came about, so I guess it's Grey Hunter, it's your turn to discuss them.
Well, vampire counts. These guys they're one of my favorite factions because they're so different from what regular fantasy vampires are. There's a lot of original flavor there. And the vampire counts. These guys are called vampire counts because they used to be electors of the province of Sylvania because they really dug deep for that one. And the von Karstein family is pretty much large and in charge in this area under Manfred, according to the releases for Warhammer Total War. So Manfred's a little bit less batshit crazy than most vampires. He doesn't want to kill everything in the world, but he does think that he is far superior to everybody else. So the vampire counts are probably not going to be allying with anybody in the game. Like there's not really going to be a reason for them to do so, because like the dwarves, they kind of see themselves as superior to everybody else.
Hmm.
I think that one of the important things about them is that they're not a unified faction. They're most definitely not a unified faction. Like they might all belong to the von Carstein family, but it's not a family. It's like we made you into a vampire. You are now with us,
Hmm.
for better or worse. But we're not going to really have like a governing council or anything like that. They're not really a political entity in the same way that the dwarves or the empire are. They're more akin to the greenskins in that sense.
Okay, so it's a bunch of sort of different independent communities centered
Pretty
around maybe
much.
their main count or their fortified Gothic castle. Then,
Yeah, technically they're all subservient to Manfred, but technicalities
so
don't
with
always work the way you think they might.
so then if the Greenskins are kind of internal squabbling, they're independent, they gather together, and then maybe they're expansionists. The dwarves are more isolationist. How would you sort of kind of boil down the vampire counts in terms of their relations to other? Are they more like kind of just sitting there with expansionist tendencies, or how would they deal with that?
They're very opportunistic.
Okay.
If there's a chance, they've tried to take over the empire before. So they are expansionist when the opportunity strikes. But for the most part, they hang around in Sylvania and curse those people who don't know what superiority is.
Mm-hmm.
They're very sit around and do nothing
I see.
sometimes. It's hard to really discuss because the vampire counts as demarked on the map aren't the entirety of the vampires. There's various types of vampires in the lore, but that's a whole other video.
Yeah, so we'll
um,
hold off on that. And I guess I would
yes.
tell people to check out both of these guys' channels. They have more in-depth look at the vampire counts. But then I guess briefly, so we can say they have taken a chunk out of the empire. They're kind of trying to do their own thing. They're opportunistic in terms of the border. It's more like depopulated, I would assume, sort of between the vampire counts and the empire. It's like marshland, kind of no one really wants to be there.
Yeah, there's
Type,
not really anybody
yeah,
living on the border. It's a very kind of scary place. Sylvania is technically still part of the empire.
I see.
The counts of the bordering electorships have
Still,
technically got rulership over the area that is Sylvania, but they don't really enforce it because, well, vampires.
Okay, and I can see to the east they're also bordering the dwarves. So how does that relationship go down?
Not very well, really. One of the vampire count families, one of the original families actually, has taken over a dwarven hold. So the dwarves and the vampires don't really get along all that well. The dwarves already have a very they already pretty much hate everything that's undead for various reasons, mainly because they see it as unnatural, because it is. But they've got a very special place in their book of grudges for the vampire counts. They
I
do
see.
not like them.
Okay, all right. So I
it's
guess
probably good to mention that the dwarves are ancestral worshippers, and as so for them, someone raising the holy
Yeah,
dead, so to say, to life is pretty much the worst thing you could do.
hmm.
yeah. The vampires did that when they took over this hold that they took, Silver Pinnacle, I believe, and the reaction of the surviving dwarves who were still fighting at the time was not good.
So you're telling me there were vampire dwarves, or at that point, or undead
No,
dwarves
no, there's
raised
not
up,
vampire dwarves. There's they just raised them as
undead dwarves?
yeah, basically
Oh,
skeletons to serve in the army.
okay.
That's also one of the other reasons that they're reviled very much. Regular vampires look pretty much like a regular person. They're just a bit more pale. Sometimes they look very gaunt and drawn out. But for all intents and purposes, they don't look that especially different. Their armies do, though, because their armies are generally skeleton hordes.
Gotcha. All right. So
So,
if people want to learn more about that, we'll direct them to your both of your guys' channels. I know you guys go into that more in depth. So let's move on to the elephant in the room, I guess, the Empire, the sort of most not generic of factions, but kind of the main protagonist of the story. It's the humans. You relate to them. They're kind of the biggest, most powerful in the center here. And I'll pass this on to Arch, and you can maybe touch on I emphasize touch on internal politics, and then we'll move on to sort of border relations.
Well, okay, lightly touch on. Well, let's see.
Show them the
Um,
ways, Arch.
how do I even lightly touch on something like this?
Maybe
Let's
start with the
begin with
elected
the
counts.
elephant's basic anatomy, then, shall we?
Yes.
The Empire is ruled by Karl Franz, the big-ass gentleman on the Griffin that you undoubtedly saw in the introductory trailer thingy-bob, and he is the Emperor. Now, in the Empire, the Emperor is not a hereditary title, it is a elector, an electoral monarchy, I suppose is what you should probably be calling it. And he is elected by his elector counts, each of which is a very powerful noble in his own rights, and he rules one of the. Is it 12 now?
I believe
Uh,
it's 12 now, yes. No,
yes.
11.
Is it
Solon
12
doesn't
now? 11?
exist. It's
Yes,
11.
Solon is. Because it used to be 14, I believe, with Sylvania, Solon, and
Lightly,
two
gentlemen,
others.
lightly.
Yes,
Well, we need to get the
trying.
number right, Oakley.
But the internal politics of the empire is stable to the point that major civil wars, large scale civil wars encasing the entirety of the empire, are rare. Border skirmishes between the various counts, that's far more common, either it's over a slight, an insult, resources, or even just minor drafts of land, or in some cases, who actually controls the land. The elected Count of Middenheim has, on several occasions, tried to shunt the parts of the Drakvold over to his neighbors, because that particular part of the empire is filled to the absolute brim by beastmen.
Hmm.
Yes. There's a If you think of it sort of like the robber barons and the counts and dukes, etc., of the Holy Roman Empire of our history, where they'd raid each other, they'd argue about border disputes, and occasionally the emperor would intercede and go, right, stop it.
Yeah.
You're not far off
So
when it
there's
comes to the internal politics
So
of the
you
empire.
expect some internal friction, but not squabbling quite like the Greenskins. They still have a sense of unity as the Empire, right?
Precisely. Civil wars have happened before
Mhm.
because a country that's existed for almost 2,500 years is going to have some civil wars going on.
Yeah.
But generally, they've been short, bloody, and eventually someone has come out as the victor.
Okay.
So they're fairly unified
And
in
even
that
during
sense.
one of these civil wars that lasted for, I think, like 300 bloody years, the War of the Three Emperors, even then, when once faced with an external threat like the Vampire Count, which was the external threat at the time, since this was the time when they tried to take over the Empire, they did in fact unify and fought together against that external threat. So even if the Empire is in practically open civil war, if chaos comes knocking, they are going to be uniting to deal with them first.
Okay. So then
Though it
we,
should be mentioned
yeah.
that usually that's because the various fighting factions figure whoever saves the empire gets to be emperor because they're
Indeed.
elected. So
I see. Hmm.
there's still politics going on even when the external threat's knocking at your door.
So then to the south, we have the Vampire Counts. We've already discussed that. It's kind of a depopulated, scary no man's land, and opportunistic vampires will come and attack them. And the Empire kind of tacitly says, "We're not really going to touch you," and kind of leave it there. And then
Pretty
the
much.
border with
They'd
the
like to go in and fix the problem, but nobody really wants to go in and fix the problem.
okay, and then
Guerrilla warfare in marshlands with the undead,
the border with the
not that appealing.
dwarves is, from what I remember in a little bit of the lore, it's actually pretty friendly. Although I assume some meddling humans might go and mess with the dwarves, but for the most part, they're sort of allies, right?
There's an ancient friendship there. The creator of the Empire, Sigmar, helped the High King of the Dwarves at the time by saving him from being captured by orcs. So essentially, he fought the greatest enemy of the dwarves and earned eternal gratitude. The Empire kind of holds on to that because the dwarves, like they remember slights against them, also remember great friendships. And they kind of they have something of a semi-official alliance. The dwarves generally see that the Empire is the biggest faction of men around and is usually the most helpful when it comes to dealing with their particular enemies. And they have a common cause against chaos, so.
Okay. All right, so then at this point, we've kind of covered all of the major factions. I guess the Empire will touch briefly on some of those borders, and then later on, I think we'll split this up into another video where we go into the minor factions because there's a lot there. But while we're
There
still
are.
on the Empire, let's talk a little bit about the northeast border. What's going on there with Kislev, Grey Hunter, if you want to talk about that.
Kislev. Kislev is a land of ice. It's people do not like it when you say that it's like Russia, for obvious reasons. And yes, I know Poland and the Ukraine are also involved in the cultural background of Kislev. But for all intents and purposes, Kislev is basically Russia. They field large armies of, well, Cossacks essentially, and they stand right between the Empire and this thing called Troll Country. Troll Country is just basically a little bit south of the Chaos Wasteland. And what that basically means for Kislev is that anybody who has to attack the Empire, because that's what Chaos likes to do, has to go through Kislev, which means Kislev, for the 500 years that it's existed in the lore, is very, 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 very fought over. They've never really had peace, as it were. But they are good friends with the Empire, naturally, because they're right there to the southern border, and the northern elect accounts do generally march to Kislev's aid when they call.
Because
Think kind of like
if anything,
Gondor and Rohan
yeah,
in
I was
Lord of
gonna
the
say, if
Rings.
anything is getting through Kislev, what's it gonna hit next? The Empire. So they have a vested
Exactly,
interest in protecting them.
pretty much. They currently have, and I love this because it just sounds so weird to say. Their current ruler is Tsarina Katerina, the Ice Queen.
Yeah,
Now say that and try not to think of Xena Warrior Princess. I dare you. Go on.
yeah.
They generally have they generally don't really have all that much contact with other races and other nations that much. I mean, like they border the dwarves, but the dwarves don't really talk to them so much.
Hmm.
So Kislev is kind of like the vampire counts in they're just there, but nobody really acknowledges them except in times of dire need.
Okay. So let's
Poor Kislev.
let's pivot over to the west then, before we wrap up this first video on the main geopolitics. So the last little corner of the empire, I mean, you can see on the bottom they're fringing the dwarves. Then west they have kind of mountains, and then mostly the main faction you're dealing with on the west is going to be Bretonia. But then there's also this no man's land there. So I'll pass this on to Arch if you first want to tackle that no man's land, which is Marienburg, right?
Marienburg, yes. Well,
Mhm.
Marienburg is probably going to be a neutral province because they are, at this point in time, as we are assuming, at this point in time anyway, with Karl Franz and all of that, that they are in a tacit relationship, yes, indeed, alliance with the Empire. The Empire is not going to be attacking them anytime soon because Marienburg is far too important for them as a trade city and as a hub of commerce. And every time they've tried to take it back, it failed because Marienburg was a part of the Empire until they gave a ridiculously large sum of money to the then rather corrupt emperor, who then gave them their independence, so to say. So generally, they can assume that the Empire will help them against Bretonia, for example, but that's not because they're particularly keen on Marienburg. It's just because, well, we're definitely not going to let the Bretonians have it if we can't have it.
So is the squabble between Bretonia and the Empire kind of like a France-England type of relationship, or what are we talking about here?
Kind of.
Somewhat more peaceful, I'd say, but
Okay.
it certainly has some turbulent periods.
They're not quite as bad.
Okay.
They didn't have 100 years war kind of scenario
Right,
over
that's
the
what I was
crown or
wondering.
something like that.
Okay.
There has been wars, definitively, but
Yes.
no one's really been able to emerge a victor simply because the borders are so problematic to actually cross. You've got a relatively small pass in the mountains, which, if you're going to march an army through there, the vast majority of them are going to get butchered. Moving through Athelorn's not a bloody option. So
Athelauren,
the
by the way, is the Wood Elves.
That's right.
Yes, and they
Yes.
don't take kindly to intruders generally.
Yes.
So the only real option is heading north in the land bridge, in which case you have perfectly flat terrain where the armies of knights will essentially do exactly what you think they do. They butcher each other pretty much to the last man, and no one's actually been able to get a decisive victory. So
So they're
it
not
usually just peters out.
they're not actively seeking to take over the other empire. They're just kind of squabbling over territories and letting the testosterone boil over in some little skirmishes on the border, I guess.
Essentially.
Okay.
They'd happily
Essentially.
kill each other off, but
It's
no one's been
yeah.
able to actually find a way to do that in a cost-effective manner.
Okay. And let's say there's a huge storm of chaos, big invasion coming from the north. Could you see Bretonia sending aid to the empire?
Yes,
They do
simply because
help.
Bretonia knows exactly what's going to be happening to them if the Empire falls. It's kind of the same idea with Kislev, really. Kislev falls, Empire falls, Bretonia falls, everyone dies.
Another thing to mention with the Bretonians as well is that their sense of honor, because they're very big on the whole knights thing. They're very much like France in that. Their sense of honor pretty much demands that if chaos is coming to attack the realms of men, they must go and fight it.
Okay.
And usually, when chaos does come charging over the Kislevite border, they declare an errantry war, which is basically like every young knight who wants to earn his spurs can go and fight and earn his spurs instead of having to do like a quest.
I see.
So Bretonia likes these things because they like to fight.
Okay. Well, I think at this point we've gone over pretty good, I think, for an introductory video for the main faction. So just to recap, we have the Greenskins, a lot of infighting, and then they'll lash out and be pretty aggressive once they have kind of the critical capacity to do so. They'll lash out, have kind of a crusade. Moving on to the Dwarves, they're kind of isolationist, fiercely defensive about their territories. They hold grudges with their neighbors, but they're not really going to go ahead and invade any other country besides maybe trying to reclaim some of their lost Karaks. Then we have vampire counts kind of sitting there, depopulated zones. They're mostly sticking to themselves and being opportunistic. And then you have the Empire, kind of internal squabbling, but they can unite. They have sort of friendly relationships with their neighbors in times of war with external threats, but once external threats die out, then you have internal squabbling. So is that kind of a pretty good overview, you guys would say, for the main playable factions?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it.
Somewhat shortish in my
Right.
Oh,
taste.
Arch. Oh, Arch. If we were going to get our nerd on, if we were really going to get our nerd on, this video would not be like 20, 30 minutes.
Right, and
Let's be honest.
this video was supposed to cover all the factions initially, and we've only done the main ones. So I'm gonna cut it off here, and we'll catch up on another video covering the minor factions. So
We're sorry.
if you guys are interested in this kind of content, definitely stay around for the next video. Otherwise, go ahead and check out both Arch Warhammer and Grey Hunter's channels for faction specific and army specific looks, and even all sorts of those details. Because I can't go into the depth here, so I defer to their expertise. Anyways,
What
thanks
he
so
means
much.
is
Yeah.
nerds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at this point, everyone is kind of watching a video to learn more about a fantasy world. So we're all in the same boat. It's just you guys have maybe perhaps a different. You have a
Our
degree
boat is
in
larger.
nerdiness or whatever it is.
Oh, we're officially PhD'd.
Yeah. All right. So I'll leave it there. Stay tuned for more, guys, and make sure to check out both of these individuals' channels. They're great. See you all in the next one.
Bye.